Hello, my name is Keith Kruger. I'm CEO of COSIN, the Consortium for School Networking, where we represent the heads of technology in our school systems. And I have the honor this year of being chair of the Learning First Alliance. The Learning First Alliance is a partnership of leading education organizations representing more than 10 million educators dedicated to improving student learning in America's public schools. We share examples of success, encourage collaboration at every level, and work toward the continual and long-term improvement of public education based on solid research. This webinar is part of our work celebrating Public School Week. And the theme of this year's week is Public School Proud. We're striving to create safe, equitable, and engaging public schools that overcome the significant upheaval and trauma brought by the last 2 years. We want to show the strength and potential of our nation's public schools and our students' futures. This is the third of several webinars this week, and today we're going to be looking at what are the public's opinion on public education. I want to also mention that there is a congressional resolution that's just been introduced in Congress to celebrate Public Schools Week, talking about how the public has been and continues to be supportive of their local schools, that during the pandemic, schools have taken on significant new roles and expanded roles, for instance, in feeding hungry students and their families, and have become hubs for keeping students and staff members safe. And they've been helping families, communities, staff members, and students with mental health and well-being challenges. And from my own organization, we've seen how schools are using technology that communicates between families and teachers, and how that's improved and expanded, how bandwidth and privacy are particularly key policy issues, and that online learning can be coordinated with in-person instruction. We're all working to build schools that we want to move going forward and not simply going back to what was, which didn't work for a lot of kids. So it's my pleasure to introduce our first presenter, my friend and colleague, Amanda Carhuse. Amanda is the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the National Association of Secondary School Principals, known as NASSP. There she coordinates all federal policy and advocacy efforts. Prior to being at NASSP, she was a senior writer and editor for the Women's Congressional Policy Institute and worked on Capitol Hill for Congresswoman Karen Thurman of Florida. She has a BA from the University of Mary Washington and an MA from the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. So with that, I'll turn it over to Amanda to set the stage.
Great, thank you, Keith. So as Keith mentioned, the COVID-19 pandemic had a huge impact on our nation's children and their families, as schools were forced to close their buildings and quickly transition to distance learning in March 2020. Teachers, principals, and other school staff were celebrated for their tireless efforts to ensure kids still had access to meals, devices, and instructional materials and wellness services. But under-resourced schools faced insurmountable challenges, and many families grew frustrated with continued mitigation strategies as restrictions in other public venues have been lifted. A number of LFA members published survey results in the past year, revealing public opinion about our nation's public schools, and the findings vary depending on how closely connected individuals are to their public schools. For example, the National School Boards Association found that only 27% of likely voters thought public schools were doing an excellent or good job on a national level. 66 of their respondents said that public schools are doing just a fair or a poor job. But more than 7 in 10 parents of public school children gave a high performance rating to their children's schools in a survey by the American Federation of Teachers. And only 7% of parents in that survey gave their children's school a low rating. Similarly, the National Education Association found that 88% of public school parents approved how their children's teachers were handling the pandemic. When asked about the top issues facing education and the greatest worries regarding children's education, lost instructional time was a common theme, with 88% of likely voters saying this was a problem in the NSBA survey compared to 72% of AFT respondents. Students losing out on social interactions was also cited by 55% of NEA respondents and 70% of AFT respondents as a major concern. And despite COVID exposure notifications and parent concerns going into this school year, the National PTA found that more parents are increasingly comfortable having their children attend school in person than at the beginning of the year. The numbers are currently 7 in 10 parents feeling at least somewhat comfortable compared to only 6 in 10 in August. The percentage of parents who want their child learning in person has also increased since August from 48% to 56%. And while comfort with in-person learning increased across the board, it was particularly notable among Hispanic parents, increasing from 53% in August to 68% in the PTA survey. Another issue that is top of mind for both educators and parents is mental health and social and emotional wellness. 75% of AFT's respondents said that the shortage of school counselors and nurses was a top concern. And 50% of school counselors told the American School Counselor Association that they were challenged by high caseloads. A survey we released at NASSP in December also found that 59% of principals said that providing mental health support to students was one of their biggest challenges during the pandemic. The PTA also noted that many parents are actively engaged in supporting their child's mental health and are looking to support their child's social and emotional well-being at home and at school. They also found that the desire for social and emotional support is higher among parents whose schools have shut down at some point during the school year due to COVID-19. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention the stress and burnout facing many teachers and school leaders today. 91% of NEA members said that general stress from the pandemic is a very serious or somewhat serious issue, and 90% are very concerned about educator burnout. The principals responding to the NASSP survey also said that one of their biggest challenges during COVID was providing guidance and mental health support to teachers and other school staff. I know that all of the LFA member organizations are worried about ongoing staff shortages and the number of educators who may leave the profession because of pandemic-related stress, and we'll be making this a top policy priority in the coming years. Finally, I'll note that links to all of the surveys I referenced and other resources will be available for download on the Public School Proud website. And I will now turn the program back over to Keith to introduce our outstanding panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda. That's really some great data and points to start our conversation. And to guide us through that conversation is a skilled moderator, Bill Bashaw. Bill served as executive director of the National Assessment Governing Board. And prior to that, he was chief executive officer of Phi Delta Kappa International for over a decade. He served as deputy superintendent in the Michigan Department of Education and state director of the Michigan North Central Association. Also, he was a principal, assistant principal, and teacher in various Michigan school districts. He has a PhD from the University of Michigan and for 30 years served in the U.S. Navy, where he retired at the rank of captain and earned the Legion of Merit. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bill and take away this great discussion.
Well, thank you, Keith. Thank you very much. First of all, Amanda, what a great job summarizing all that we've learned through these surveys over the years. That was extraordinary, so succinctly done. Congratulations, not an easy job. So tonight, Keith and Rich Long, the executive director at LFA, have assembled an extraordinary panel to talk to us about these findings that Amanda shared with us and to dive in a little deeper. So what we want to do next is I'm going to make some introductions. I'm honored to make introductions of our panelists tonight. I'm going to start with Kate Clayball. Kate is a social worker turned lobbyist. Now, I know that's a shocking thing to have anybody do that in the city of Washington, D.C., but sure enough. Kate recently joined the National PTA as the Director of Government Affairs, and she has previously served in similar roles at the National Out-of-School Time Associations, the Boys and Girls Clubs of America, and the National Recreation and Parks Association. Kate also has extensive knowledge of federal child nutrition programs, having spent 5 years with the Food Research and Action Center, a national anti-hunger organization. Kate is a proud graduate of the District of Columbia Public Schools and went on to earn her bachelor's degree in women's studies and globalization from Gettysburg College in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and then her master in social work from Catholic University in Washington, D.C. Kate, welcome. Next, allow me to introduce Princess Moss, Vice President of the National Education Association, the nation's largest professional organization. She previously served as NEA's Secretary Treasurer and also 2 terms as on the NEA Executive Committee. Her responsibilities at NEA, Princess was a member of multiple committees, including the influential Elementary and Secondary Education Advisory Committee. Starting her education career as a music teacher at the elementary school level in Virginia, Princess was ultimately elected president of the Virginia Education Association, and where she also served on the Commonwealth's P16 Education Council. Princess earned her bachelor's degree in music education from the University of Mary Washington. University of Mary Washington is well represented tonight, I must say, and later received the university's Distinguished Alumnus Award. Congratulations, Princess. And she currently serves on the university's Board of Visitors. Princess earned her master's degree in elementary and secondary administration from the University of Virginia. Princess, thank you for serving on the panel. Randy Weingarten is president of the American Federation of Teachers, a union that represents over 1.7 million members in education, healthcare, and several other fields. Prior to her election as AFT president in 2008, Randy served 11 years as president of the United Foundation of Teachers, Local 2, representing 200,000 educators in the New York City public school system. Still, Randy remains proud of her time teaching history at Clara Barton High School in Brooklyn's Crown Heights neighborhood. Did I get that right, Randy? I hope. Helping her students win several state and national awards. Randy holds degrees from Cornell University School of Industrial and Labor Relations and at Corzano School of Law. She is an active member of the Democratic National Committee and numerous professional, civic, religious, and philanthropic organizations. Randy, it's so good to have you join us. And she's not here yet. She's a little delayed getting on. We're hopeful that she can make it. We have a 4th panelist. I'm going to make introductions now in the event that she'll be able to join us in a little bit. Noelle Ellerson-Ning is the Associate Executive Director of the School Superintendents Association, AASA, where she directs advocacy and government efforts and spearheads their work with the Congress and U.S. Department of Education. She is well published, including several book chapters, articles, white papers covering education policy and superintendent advocacy. And again, we're going to be hopeful that Noelle can join us in a little bit. So with those introductions behind us, by prior agreement with the panelists, I'm going to ask a series of questions for the next few minutes. And I plan to direct these questions at individual panelists. However, at any time, members of the panel should feel comfortable adding comments to any of the questions or responses that were asked. And throughout the night, I may ask a few follow-up questions myself. As Amanda started talking and discussing, it's been over 100 years since this planet has experienced the kind of disruption, at least a natural disruption, that we've lived through since March 2020. And that is certainly the case in public education in the United States. I commend the organizations represented today on the panel as having done this country a great service in helping understand scientifically how parents, teachers, and school leaders are working together towards common goals. So with that, let's dive into our first question. This question, I'm going to direct it to both Randy and Kate, and I'll let you decide who wants to jump in here first. So here's the first question. Given all that has occurred in the last few years, do you sense a wedge or division between the American public and their public schools? A wedge and a division that we haven't seen before. So Randy, Kate, who wants to jump in?
Please go ahead, Randy.
I was going to say, see, this is an example of how we actually work together. We ask each other what we think and who should go first. I mean, so, I remember first off, thank you, Bill, and thank you for your preface. And thank you also to Amanda for pulling together a bunch of the research, including, frankly, there's new research today that Ron Bronstein talked about, including a CBS News poll that said 80% of people oppose banning books from school libraries. 2/3 say teaching about race makes students more empathetic. And even in Florida and in Texas, there is huge opposition to what's going on. So the question really is, why do we see what we see? And remember, I'm a history teacher. At different periods of time in America, we've seen these tectonic plates and this disruption kind of create a lot of fear and anxiety. Think about what happened in the teaching of biology and evolution in the 1920s. Think about what happened in the aftermath or during the last Cold War. With, when I was a kid and we had to, there were all these bomb scares and people hiding under their desks and what was going to happen in terms of Russia and that kind of fear. And what happened before that in the 50s with the McCarthy fear. So if you take those fears and you multiply that by a gazillion, which is what happened with the pandemic, something that none of us ever had the muscle to deal with. When did we ever have a crisis like this in America, in modern history? Every other crisis in modern history was somewhere outside of our shores. Or if there was a crisis like 9/11, it was in certain areas in the country, or a hurricane, or a fire. This is 2 years of disruption to everyone's life, whether they've had people in their family who were felled by coronavirus, or whether their kids didn't go to school for a period of time, whether their jobs were, whether they were laid off, or whether they are dealing with higher prices at the gas pumps. Everyone has been affected, and it creates a huge level of anxiety and stress. And that kind of anxiety and stress, if you take that and the polarization in the country right now with social media and with all of this other stuff, it frankly is not, you then get to a positioning or get to a sense that there's, of course, some wedges, because in normal times, you see wedges between the privatizers, the people who don't want to have public education, the people who don't want to invest in our schools that all kids deserve. And when you add all of this on top of all of the political ideology, my sense is I would have expected more. When you see this polling data that shows the gratitude, whether it's NEA or PTA or AFT polling data, the gratitude that parents have towards teachers, you basically have a 7 in 10, an 8 in 10. This is the direction we should have. Now, Does that mean we're out of the woods? Not at all. And frankly, we have to be really, really intentional about the engagement strategy between parents and teachers. We have to find ways that we're working together, not going down the rabbit holes of the political attacks and things like that, but how we're working together to help solve the problems of learning loss. Yes, I know we don't like using that word. To help solve the academic, the social, and the emotional needs of kids, and to help deal with the shortages and these other types of things. And frankly, I'm not saying we should have blinders on, but instead of going through the rabbit holes of responding every single time to the attacks and to this and that, what we should be doing as a school community is what we do the best, which is making every single public school a place parents want to send their kids, educators want to work, and kids thrive. And that's what we've been trying to do with our new Reading Opens the World initiative. That's what we're trying to do with the work that we're now doing with NewsGuard to make sure that teachers and kids have the kind of knowledge of what is misinformation and what isn't. And that's what we're trying to do all across America with community schools, with standing them up, and with trying to do more and more work, as we did today, in new and different and embracive ways that we can work with parents and students to ensure that kids have the schools that they deserve.
Thanks, Randy. Kate, what from your perspective and from the perspective of the National PTA, what are your impressions?
Thanks so much, Bill, for having us. And I can speak as a COVID mother. Parents generally are burnt out. Families are burnt out. Our educators are burnt out. I so appreciate across the surveys that the mental health and social emotional needs of our nation's students was lifted up. It cannot be more important. Our nation's public school students, families, and educators have faced so many challenges the past few years amidst COVID, not to mention the ongoing gun and school safety epidemic and the fight for racial justice and equity in our country. But we know out of crisis comes opportunity. And I couldn't agree more with Randy that we have seen an incredible effort in communities coming together, whole school communities coming together. Our teachers are parents are teachers. And now is absolutely the time for us to be working together to ensure that we are creating safe learning environments where students feel supported and ready to learn. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. Princess, let's turn to you. Again, given what's occurred in the recent past, as we've talked about, how are teachers holding up? How are they working with and engaging the parents and guardians of the children in their classroom?
All right. I know, how long have we been in this? And I still have to be reminded sometimes that I have to unmute. Oh, wow. But thank you. Thank you, Bill. And thank you to the Learning First Alliance for your interest in the views of the National Education Association. Educators are going to extraordinary and creative lengths to partner with parents. Zoom and video conferencing have opened up a whole new creative way of communication. I mean, who ever heard of Zoom before the pandemic? Yet, even before the pandemic, educators were connecting with parents. And during the pandemic, during COVID, when everyone was quarantined, our teachers never stopped caring or teaching. My friend Angela is a high school special education teacher in Richmond City. She would call me consistently and tell me how she'd meet with her colleagues at her school and put together learning resource packets that students could use at home, and how she helped pack grocery bags of food so her students and her students' families wouldn't go hungry. Angela was not alone. There are thousands of teachers just like Angela all across the country who made sure that their students and their families had what they needed to grow and thrive during the pandemic. And in doing so, I would be remiss if I did not remind everyone that educators risk their lives in doing so. Some even died in the line of duty. This is unparalleled partnership with parents. What greater devotion could anyone ask? It was honest to goodness love in its purest form. You know, another partnership that educators are connecting with parents is around student social and emotional needs, which we've heard mentioned many times. The pandemic exacerbated the need for help in this area. The trauma that our students, especially our students from our Black and Brown communities, the trauma that they endured during the pandemic is another concern of educators. And I'll share with you that a recent KFF vaccine monitor noted that 52% of Hispanic parents and 49% of lower income parents say at least one of their children has shown symptoms of new mental health issues in the past 12 months. Another KFF report from last year shows that during the pandemic, Black and Latino parents had higher rates of illness and death from COVID-19, from financial loss and poor mental health, all of which could negatively impact their children's mental health. You know, I could go on and talk about how the mental health of our students in our LGBTQ plus community and the intersectionality with our Black, Latino, and Asian American communities are severely impacted when it comes to mental health. Our own poll showed our members are eager for mental health resources for their students. And I understand there's another panel tomorrow that's going to address mental health, but our members are concerned. And I wanted to make sure that that I shared that. And, you know, we had a poll, 94% of our members said that providing additional mental health support for students would help address their burnout. So that's really a point that we need to know. We're also hearing that school nurses need more resources as well. Educators want to partner with parents to ensure students get the resources they need to be safe, healthy, and engaged in learning. And some of those resources, such as the money to address mental health services, learning gaps, as well as ventilation, among other things, are made possible by the American Rescue Plan. And thank you to the Biden administration. We will be celebrating the anniversary of that plan in just a couple of weeks. And I'll say this and end on this. With the return to in-person learning, many of the creative solutions have continued, as well as the partnership between parents and educators, and having a strong relationship with parents, with families, has always been paramount to educators. And now more than ever, we know that that partnership is what will lead to ultimate student success. So thank you for the question.
Thanks, Princess. And I see Noelle has been able to join us. Noelle, we were able to make an introduction earlier, so our viewers know a little bit of your background, but welcome.
Good to see you, Bill. Thank you for having me. My apologies for my calendar snafu.
No apologies necessary. So, well, let me ask Kate a question. So the National PTA has more contact with parents than any other organization in America. What is National PTA recommending to parents about engaging with their schools?
Thanks so much, Bill. I actually think it really builds on what Princess was just talking about. Partnerships, partnerships, partnerships. Now is the time for families, educators, and schools to work together to develop those strong partnerships. Families should provide teachers and schools with information about how their children have been doing during COVID. What have the really direct impacts been made either individually or as a family? Have they lost a caregiver? Have they experienced a traumatic event? We're very cognizant of adverse childhood experiences, and the rate at which that has happened during COVID is alarming statistically. So that is real information that the teacher knows to safely welcome students back to the classroom. Teachers should provide families with information. How is their child doing? Well-being being the most important right now, to really have clear check-in, emotional wellness check-ins. How are they doing? How are they handling it? Socialization has been missed this whole time. How are they connecting with their friends again? Are they excited about activities again that they might have previously been pre-COVID? Those are really critical things for families and teachers to have open dialogue about, two-way communication, keeping in touch often, reaching out to each other frequently and regularly. Parents are more aware than ever before of what it takes to get their kids focused and engaged in learning. So now's the time to have those critical conversations, developing those partnerships that perhaps weren't quite there, weren't quite as robust pre-COVID. Now's the time to rebuild those partnerships. That trust could not be more important. We are entrusting teachers with the health and well-being of our kids during the school day. And we want to also mirror lessons learned during the school day at home as parents. How can we continue to support learning at home, at school, so our kids can start to thrive?
Thanks, Kate. Noelle, let's turn to you. Like Kate and the other groups represented on this panel, I know that AASA is in close contact with its members. So how are superintendents describing the attitudes held by parents and other members of the public at the local level in regards to the public schools they lead?
Thank you, Bill. That's a really good question. And the timing of this conversation in the context of AASA couldn't be any better. We just had our in-person national conference last week in Nashville, and we had a 15-year high in terms of attendance. I think it really was about taking a moment to recognize what everyone in education is enduring, but also being able to be with the other people who've lived that experience the same way you have. And looking at this question and preparing my comments, I think the biggest takeaway is what the superintendent's report is what the polling shows every year, both what PDK shows every year, as well as what AFT and NEA reported, right? People grade what they know really well and fall a little prey to media national headlines when they're reporting on systems overall. So if you ask superintendents to describe their board relationship, overwhelmingly people will say it's excellent, healthy, and good. But that's not the narrative that you see when you have it aggregated up to the federal level, right? And in particular, as it relates to support for their own public schools or their relationship with their parents, it's going as well as it can, particularly in the middle of a pandemic. Is it important to have the tough conversations? Yeah, and they're trying to lean into those about what are the dollars that we're going to spend? What are the populations we're going to prioritize? Who are the kids who need the help the most? And an increasing shift in the conversation is what can we do to support our parents and supporting their kids? And also, what can we do to support our staff, not only in the context of retention, but also in just their mental health and wellness for what they're enduring, but really largely mirroring what we've seen year in and year out, that they give a good grade to what they know and like the schools that they're a part of, that they're supporting, that are in their community.
Noelle, back to you. I have to ask you to do an introduction of the other person in the screen, if you don't mind. Let us know who that is. And I mean, it's what we're all talking about today. It was sitting on your lap, right?
Yes, this is my son, Henry. He's 2.5, and the babysitter is here, but he wanted to do the meeting, and it was easier to have him on my lap than to hear him through the door. So Henry is here doing the meeting, and we live down the street from the public school that he will enroll in 3 years. We're very excited.
Well, welcome, Henry. We're glad you could join us. Let's see, Randy, can we come back to you? The elephant in the room is polarization, and in many cases, politically based. What recommendations do you have for how teachers and other educators can deal with this polarization and its impact on teaching and learning in public education?
So I'm glad you just asked that. We are in the middle of our national meeting today, and I actually talked about this very question and used this really amazing new study called Civic Virus from the Hartward Institute for Public Innovation in collaboration with the Kettering Foundation, as well as a lot of the historians and what they have said about this moment in time. And frankly, going back to what Hamilton and Madison said about what they were most concerned about in terms of America. What they were most concerned about is not polarization. We have polarization all the time, but it's the factionalization. It's the cracking open. It's the tribalism. It's the using of social media and of conspiracy theories that put people in their tribes, and that instead of solving problems like, you know, a better life for all, like great public education for all, that people go into their different tribes and stay there. It's part of the reason why integration of schools is so important. It's part of the reason why integration of work is so important. It's part of the reason why diversity is so important. And so we have spent a good long time over the last few months thinking about all of this and what is the role of a union of professionals in terms of helping to combat this. And number one, it is how there's a saying that I've been using more and more and more, which is enlarging the tent, which is how you have to, and this is what the writers of civic virtue for Civic Virus have said too. It's how do we actually talk to people, not only see ourselves and see each other and respect each other, but how do we also start talking to people who are different? How do we engage? How do we enlarge the tent? How do we actually do the kind of work that the teaching of honest history is about, that frankly, diversity, inclusion, and equity is about? How do we help have that community over chaos, which Martin Luther King talked about? How do we have a pathway to a better life? In our view, it's a very vibrant labor movement. It's a very vibrant and well-funded pre-K through higher education. And it's a vibrant democracy, including the rule of law, including having voter access, and including the kind of government services that people see and have that is a pathway to a better life and to overcome grievances. So I wrote this column in the New York Times last week for those who saw it, which is that we choose, and I would argue that every educator, we're in the aspiration business. We choose aspiration over fear, aspiration over anger. And that's what we do day to day. So we need to solve the shortages, but we need to work together with the superintendents, with the NEA, with parents, that we solve the shortages, that we actually make sure we have pipeline issues and pipeline responses like we just did last week in terms of Newark, New Jersey, where there's a teacher academy, but the kids who are in it, high school kids that are in it, one of the issues were that for them to be in the dual enrollment programs that they have with Montclair State, lots of our kids have to work during their semesters. So we have to find ways to substitute for that pay if we want them to be in a dual enrollment program. So what the AFT did is we said, we're going to pay for the stipends for the Grow Your Own program for the teachers in the Teacher Academy. This is an academy that we started with the Newark schools and with Montclair State University. And we went to the Teacher Academy in the East Side High School, where with the teachers have done such great work with the kids who want to become teachers, diverse, Black and brown kids who want to become teachers in the Newark public schools. And we said, okay, for this year, we'll see the stipends. We'll get it from the American Rescue Plan or somewhere else next year, but let's make sure we solve these problems. And so that's what starts overcoming polarization. The trust, the transparency, the working together on a shared agenda that is directly affecting kids, their parents, and communities. And so it is the factionalization rather than the polarization, and it is the engagement, trusting, building credibility, being transparent that will enlarge the tent and move us ahead.
Thanks, Randy. Let me see if there's anybody else on the panel that wants to talk a little bit about this, as I described it, the elephant in the room, the polarization.
I think it's fair to say that emotions are running high on all fronts. And as we've mentioned, I think for a very good reason, where we can bring civility to discourse, where we can bring mutual respect and understanding of all sides. That's certainly what we're encouraging, and we'll certainly work with our partners in the education space to do so.
And piggybacking off of what Kate just referenced, superintendents feel a responsibility to model, right? And we know that school district and school board meetings in particular have been thrust into the limelight for a significant increase in the politicization of the tone of their meetings. And if anything, it's an opportunity to lean in and lead through political tension, right? It's an opportunity to model everything that all these groups at this table are talking about: validation of emotions, validation of important feelings, of validation to a certain extent of opinion, but seeking to understand, making room at the table. I love Randy's expression of just make the tent bigger, because you can't come to an understanding if not everyone's at the table or under the tent, right? And so I see the superintendents feeling a responsibility to lean in and lead through and create a forum where they can demonstrate to the children and the students and their staff and their community that we won't shy away from the tough conversations, no matter how unruly or unproductive they may seem. We're here for the long haul. And I know that that was at front of mind for a lot of our members last week.
Thank you. And of course, we encourage the engagement and the collaboration. We have to work together in order to move forward. You know, and one of the things that we encourage our members to do is to always tell the truth. You know, it is important that we're honest and that we model as well how we should interact with one another and how we should work together.
Noelle, back to you and our school leaders. In addition to polarization, there's just been so much uncertainty. We saw with the pandemic, the numbers were going down, and then comes Delta, and then numbers go back up, and then they go down, and then comes Omicron. And how are school leaders dealing with all this uncertainty?
The best that they can is the very quick answer, but what does that actually look like? I think it's important to frame it in the lens of, a lot of times operating a school system is something they know, right? That is their professional calling and experience. And in particularly the early days of the pandemic, when we were really trying to get good, actionable guidance, when there was this big push for the 2020-2021 school year to get schools open, the conversation wasn't, do superintendents know how to run or open a school? They know how to do that. Principals know how to do that. Teachers know how to do that. It's opening a school safely in the context of a pandemic, and nobody knew that. And I think it's humanizing the uncertainty, validating that, you know what, I am feeling uncertain. Is it going to spur me into being frozen, or is it an excuse for me to not take action? No, but that, like, understanding that everyone's experiencing uncertainty. Very few people on this planet were around for the last pandemic, right? And understanding that this is not something that is unique to school systems, right? So there's something that school systems might have been able to learn from earlier elements of civic society that had opened up more immediately, right? And when it comes to how you deal with uncertainty, the power of the 3 words, I don't know, can be very, very important. You don't have to know everything as a superintendent in the context of an endemic, of a pandemic. You're not a medical expert, but you need to know how to get access to the information to answer the questions your community members are asking. And it might not even be totally related to how many days are you going to be open or how will my child get to school, but it could be, well, what is school meal going to look like? Or my child's only going to be able to get to the school meal pickup 2 days a week. What's that going to look like? We're so reliant on the schools for the nutrition for our children. It could be, what's the school or community going to do to raise awareness around vaccine opportunity? Or is there opportunity to collaborate on vaccine clinics or a political conversation around masking? It might not be directly related to school opening or the science of COVID, but to the extent that they had a role to play as a community gatherer or building that tent like Randy referenced, sometimes that was the best that they could do in some of those instances. And that was the role they had to play until there was more certainty, either because, as you mentioned before, Bill, rates had gone down, so the community could stabilize, or there was an additional round of information, or there were other resets, right? Once the vaccines became available, there's a different level of stability. Once the boosters became available, once vaccines were available for kids as young as 11, all of that changes. And it's just looking forward, knowing that other benchmarks like that are going to come and being able to navigate through that.
Kate, to you, similar kind of question. I mean, you described yourself as a COVID mother. I thought that was interesting. In fact, I think, is there someone in your household similar to, about the age of Henry? Did I get?
Yes, Noelle and I just realized we have babies about 6 months apart. So, and fun fact from my COVID mother experience, I was without daycare for 18 months. So, COVID is real for the COVID mothers out there. So
So the uncertainty. I mean, I think we're all holding our breath, waiting, just praying that the numbers will continue to decline and so on. But what should parents expect as they move ahead for the rest of this year and maybe next fall?
Yeah, I actually so appreciate Noelle and others specifically calling out the federal child nutrition programs. Maybe a personal plug for the strength and effectiveness of the entitlement programs to really respond to the pandemic. It was one of the first resources that families could depend on. And with continued flexibilities throughout COVID, it's been especially important that parents know that they can still get meals, whether their children are learning in school, at home, or perhaps at a community-based organization. So just big shout out to USDA for all their work to maintain those efforts. Separately, National PTA, as Amanda mentioned at the top of this program, in August 2021, we did commission a national survey and listening session exploring parent mindsets. How were they feeling about COVID safety guidance? Did they feel safe sending their kids back to school? How were children's anxiety around dealing with new measures? And all the protocols that, of course, our school district leaders and educators have really are dealing with their own version of what this new normal looks like for in-person learning. What was interesting was that parents were certainly most concerned at the beginning of the school year of their children contracting COVID-19. But we've really seen, and as we revisited those survey results now in January, that concern has decreased. So that's a good sign. Additionally, I just wanted to point out, although Amanda had mentioned as well, the percentage of parents who want their child learning in person has increased since August from 48% to 56%. Parental worries and perceived child anxiety about following those safety measures, like I mentioned, have certainly decreased. And when asked to compare the emotions at the start of this school year to now, parents are reporting both themselves and their child are feeling happier, more excited, calmer, and safer. Pluralities of parents also share that negative emotions such as anxiety, frustration, confusion, sadness, and anger have decreased since the beginning of the school year. So that's certainly hopeful. And again, our kind of latest update to the survey this January showed that parents were feeling less anxious about their ability to keep their child safe while in school. They felt confident about the school's ability to actually address their child's health, safety, and social emotional needs. And what I found particularly interesting is that over half of parents we surveyed were able to identify a new resource that their school developed to address social emotional needs. So I think what we're hearing loud and clear across our organizations is we are taking social emotional well-being very seriously. This is the time for school districts to really work with parents on what do our students really need. And that's not going to look the same across districts. We need to be very cognizant of meeting families, communities where they are, where they have been historically, what impacts COVID has obviously affected communities, particularly our Black and Brown students, very differently. Let's be honest and again, meet families exactly where they are. What do they need? Let's give them a voice. Let's hear their perspective and give them a seat at the decision-making table.
Bill, can I just intervene in this question, this response too?
Sure, yeah. I have a follow-up.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Right after that, and I think that'll wrap up our questioning for tonight. But go ahead, yeah.
I want to just follow up on one of the things that Kate said. Look, we are a federated system in terms of public education. Every state to have different rules of the road. I mean, on some levels, the fact that we all got the American Rescue Plan funds was so important. And the uncertainty and the way it played out in so many different places. We had a national pandemic. We had many, many, many local responses. But one of the things that is shared, so we don't have a federal system. We have a state-based system of education and a local-based system of education. But one of the best practices that we are seeing emerging is how to create the infrastructure for what Kate just talked about. Wraparound services, ways in which schools are safe and welcoming. How do we make sure that we have those services in a way that they never go away, but maybe they are different for different places? Maybe the kind of food and nutrition services in one place is not necessary in other places, but other services are really, really necessary. How do we do all of those things? And I think things like wraparound services in community schools is a model that doesn't look the same in different places, but it is really the infrastructure for how we can do this kind of work of getting services to families that are based in schools as opposed to based in other places and communities.
So I would add to that, to echo what Randy just said. I mean, community schools are the way to go. I mean, the community schools, right? They provide the services, the wraparound services that Randy just talked about, and they support our students and families in a way that they need to be supported. So I lift that up as well. Thank you.
And I would just jump on to say community schools because where that model might not be possible, and I'm thinking in particular some of our more rural areas, a really good intermediary can often be an educational service agency and in their ability to bring a staffing capacity that an individual district might not be able to afford on their own, a full-time therapist or a full-time psychologist, but in coordination with multiple school districts that educational service agency supports, bring some of these wraparound services and make them available in communities that might not be able to do it on their own. And there's a lot of different ways to look at these important wraparound services, because I think every group represented here completely subscribes to the idea that a child is much more than a test score, and a school is now responsible for way more than just a child's academic growth and development. And as soon as we can own that and walk that walk as a society to match the walk that we expect schools to do, it'll be to the betterment of the students.
Well, let me Rich, I hope I have just a couple more minutes here. Let me ask one last question here. And Randy, it's back to you. And it's something that you said earlier that I don't think we've really touched on as much. And that's, let's be optimistic. Let's think that school next fall is going to be as normal as we can just keep our fingers crossed. What about learning loss? What about what's happened in the last 2 years with students that we're getting some results from various assessments and so on that are pointing to that? And any thoughts on addressing that?
These days, that's going to be of this period of time. you're on mute, get off mute. It's going to be the thing that will hopefully in a few years from now really laugh about. So again, I want to just say, we have never been through a period of time like this. So when we actually measure against normal times, it's a pretty flawed measurement. Having said that, we know that there's been 2 years of disruption. So how do we, over the course of this year and next, accelerate learning in such a way and make it joyful in such a way that kids feel affirmed and confident instead of feeling bad about things? And so it's one of the reasons why I'm so glad Noelle said this. The testing system this year is stupid. I'm just going to be really direct about this. Last year, none of the tests were reliable. Some kids took them, some kids didn't. This year would have been a really good year for a reset that was aligning the accountability system with what kids need to know and be able to do in the 21st century, including efficacy of learning, including joy, including, powerful instruction, including project-based learning. Given that we don't have that, we don't actually really have a measuring rod right now in terms of where kids were supposed to be, where they're supposed to be now. We can basically say this is where a third grader is or a fourth grader is. And we're going to need to have a combination of academic tools and academic work. Some of it is going to be summer school, some of it is going to be tutoring, some of it is going to be other kinds of project-based learning, and thinking about this year and next year as years of real recovery and advancement. The most important thing for me, I'll speak as a grandmother now of grandkids who are in public schools, is for my kids to feel confident and joyful that they can seize the world. And my grandkids can feel like they can overcome the trauma and the disruptions and the stress of this pandemic. And whether they're doing it, and I have a grandchild who's 2, born right before the pandemic, and a grandchild who's 6. And so their lives have really been disrupted during this period of time. How do we then, over the course of the next few years, how do they become resilient, confident, and seize the opportunities in the future?
Thank you. I think this is a great opportunity to have a panel and a way of doing it, virtually and so on. What frustrates me is right now, I would be saying thank you, and everybody, if we were doing this in person, everybody in the room would be applauding madly about the great job that everyone did on the panel, and that's missing. So I can applaud. How's that? That's at least one. How's that? Thank you, everyone. An excellent job. I really appreciate your time in helping out tonight. And with that, Rich, you and Keith did a great job putting this panel together. So thank you. And with that, let me turn it back or over to you, Rich.
Thank you, Bill. Very nice job. You all brought together some really interesting notions for us to be learning about. This week was about setting up a discussion on creating safe, equitable, engaging schools. This doesn't happen by chance. It happens by professionals, by parents being engaged with one another. What you talked about in the polls, in the polling information, and in how you interpret what's needed for the future is that people can't be afraid to be talking truth, about our history, the history of race in our country, the history of lack of funding for our schools, and the history of what our future needs to be. In one of the comments during yesterday's panel that had a group of 12 exemplars, some of the best in the country, but in reality, examples of the good of the country. One of the people talked about, we want to reopen the schools we want for our future. This is a really powerful statement. It also reminds me today of a new word about our future, and that is joy. 10 years ago, none of us would have been talking about joy. Maybe curiosity, but not about joy. Now we are saying to the leaderships of the various education parts of the community at the state and local level, you have the backing of the public at your local level to move forward. You have their trust. Use that trust judiciously, use it honestly. Move forward in what you know is important to do because the public, the parents, are telling you that it's important to do. This is not a time to be timid. It is not the time to self-censor. It is the time to demonstrate, as we do during Public Schools Week, that our professionals, our parents are engaged and know what to do. They know how to do it, but we do need your help to get it done. And with that, I want to thank all of you for taking the time. I know you worked hard at preparing for this. Tomorrow's panel on mental health is there because every one of our exemplars talked about it. Every one of you talked about it. We're cutting new grounds in public education. It is challenging, both the shortages issues that are there, the emotional challenges that need to be engaged, and yet at the same time, the public is saying, we know it's the right thing to do. Let's do it. Thank you.